Lesson 7. Managing stress and schizophrenia triggers. Schizophrenia is an illness that is extremely sensitive to stress. It is as if your mind had a thinner boundary between the inner and the outer world, and every stronger shake in daily life hits that boundary with greater force. That is why understanding how stress and symptom triggers work is one of the most important parts of therapy. Without this, even if you learn to cope with thoughts or voices, you may still experience unnecessary difficulties, because symptoms will keep switching on by themselves, like an alarm reaction to stimuli that were not really a threat. Symptom triggers, often called triggers, are any situations, emotions, stimuli, and sometimes even thoughts that cause an increase in anxiety, tension, arousal, paranoid associations, and sometimes also voices. What is important, a trigger does not have to be objectively stressful. Very often it is something ordinary, a conversation with someone, fatigue, a sleepless night, too much noise, emotions that are too intense, or even a sense of loneliness. In books and manuals on psychosis therapy, one sentence is often repeated: the problem is not the stimulus itself, but the brain's sensitivity to that stimulus. Your brain works differently. That is a fact, not a fault. If you accept that fact, you will understand that managing stress is not a luxury but a form of inner hygiene. Stress in schizophrenia does not work like normal anxiety. A person without symptoms may feel tension but is able to mentally separate the emotion from reality. A mind affected by schizophrenia, when tired or overloaded, starts giving stress a meaning. This is not a sign of weakness, it is the result of neurobiology. Increased dopamine makes ordinary stimuli appear suspicious and ordinary thoughts seem more important than the facts. Stress opens the door to interpretations that would not normally appear. That is why it is so important for you to know your triggers and to be able to stop the reaction before it develops. The first step is learning to listen to your own body. Long before a psychotic symptom appears, the body has already been sending signals. You might feel tightness in your neck, a strange agitation in your chest, heaviness under your stomach, trembling in your hands, or unease around your heart. Sometimes it feels like something is coming, though you do not know what, like the air before a storm. In CBTP, the body is seen as the best risk barometer. If you see the signals early, you can stop the emotional wave before it becomes a wave of thoughts. The second step is understanding that stress can be hidden. Sometimes it is not a big event, but the sum of small things: poor sleep, staying too long in noise, a heavy conversation, heat, fatigue, a tense atmosphere at home. Each of these is not so painful on its own, but they work like drops filling a glass. When the glass is full, even one small stimulus can make it overflow: a sudden thought that becomes suspicious, a voice that raises its tone, a gesture from someone else that starts to seem loaded or strange. That is why it is important to see stress not only in big situations, but also in everyday details. Many manuals talk about the so-called window of tolerance, a space in which your nervous system is coping well. When you are inside this window, thoughts do not turn into overinterpretations, and emotions do not lead to paranoia. But when you leave this window, because of tension, noise, confrontation, or exhaustion, the mind shifts into a state of heightened alert. In that state, everything seems more important, heavier, and more threatening. The world itself does not really change, your perceptual filter changes. This is the moment when you need to step back and let the body and breath return to balance. You are not fighting symptoms, you are returning to your window of tolerance. One of the most effective ways to cope with triggers is to identify in advance the situations that overload you. You may notice that crowds don't suit you, long phone calls wear you down, being around quarrelsome people is hard, lack of sleep hits you strongly, empty days with no purpose are risky, intense news is too much, too many responsibilities exhaust you, and other people's pressure is draining. When you know what wears you out, you can prepare a strategy, instead of reacting in panic. It is like watching the clouds before the rain starts. If you see the sky changing, you still have time to find shelter. When you feel stress rising, you can use the pause before the stimulus technique used in ACT. It means that before the mind grabs onto a negative interpretation, you make a symbolic pause. You might put your hand on your chest, take one slow breath, or look at something concrete and say quietly in your mind, "This is a moment of tension, not a fact, not a threat." That single second of pause works like cutting the fuse. The trigger stops being an impulse for thoughts and becomes a signal to ground yourself. Emotional triggers like anger, shame, guilt, or frustration can be especially painful. These emotions hit quickly, and the ego reacts with instant interpretations. They don't respect me, they're plotting something, they're talking about me. In such a situation, it is helpful to step out of the conflict space and give yourself a few minutes alone. The idea is to let the emotion settle before the mind starts explaining it. Buddhists say that an emotion is like a flame. You can put your hand into the fire and get burned, or you can wait until the flame calms down. Therapy says the same thing, just in different words. Sometimes the trigger is loneliness. In silence and in the absence of companions, thoughts may grow and voices may become more intrusive. That is why it is good to know that one of the best remedies for loneliness is not necessarily talking about problems, but simply being with someone calm. The presence of another person soothes the nervous system. The mind stops feeling so threatened, and symptoms often ease even without much conversation. On the other hand, for some people the trigger is too many people. For some individuals with schizophrenia, being in a group leads to sensory overload, too many voices, movements, emotions, gazes. In such situations, it is helpful to learn to step out for a while to another room, onto a balcony, or outside. A few minutes break gives the brain a chance to reset. This is not running away. It is psychological maturity in relation to your own sensitivity. When a trigger has appeared and your symptoms are starting to rise, do not panic. You can do 3 things that are the foundation of crisis work: slow your breathing, press your feet firmly against the ground, and name what is happening. You can say, tension is appearing, a thought is appearing, a voice is appearing, nothing more. Saying these words does not make the symptom disappear, but it does stop it from growing. This is the moment when you return to the role of observer rather than participant in chaos. Finally, remember that triggers are part of life. You cannot remove them completely. They are not the problem, the way you respond is. The goal of therapy is not to create a world without stress, that is impossible, but to create a mind that can breathe inside stress. Buddhism says that suffering arises not from the stimulus itself, but from attachment to the reaction. When you learn to react differently, the trigger loses its power. Over time you will notice that your mind becomes more stable and your symptoms start to have less power over you. Not because they disappear, but because you change your position toward them. You become someone who sees, hears, and feels, but does not get carried away by every wave. Triggers will still appear, but they will stop taking over the steering wheel of your mind. Types of schizophrenia triggers. Schizophrenia triggers are not all the same. In professional manuals they are divided into four main categories: biological, cognitive, environmental, and social. This division is not meant to complicate things, but to simplify them. It helps you understand that symptoms do not appear out of nowhere, but are the brain's response to specific kinds of strain. Biological triggers are mainly lack of sleep, fatigue, hunger, pain, dehydration, physical illness, and hormonal changes, everything that affects how the nervous system works. Cognitive triggers are certain ways of thinking, overanalyzing details, focusing too strongly on small things, interpreting neutral events as meaningful. Environmental triggers include noise, chaos, intense light, crowds, conflicts, and sudden changes of place. The last group, social triggers, concerns relationships, expectations, pressure, confrontations, and subtle tensions that can appear even in ordinary conversations. When you understand which category a stimulus belongs to, it is easier to manage its impact on your mind. One of the best researched psychotic processes is the so-called aberrant salience, giving ordinary stimuli excessive importance. This phenomenon does not come from a person's will or character, but from neurobiology. An overloaded dopamine system starts highlighting certain signals as if they were more important than they really are. An ordinary sound becomes a signal, an innocent gesture seems to have a hidden meaning, and a random glance triggers suspicion. This mechanism explains why delusional interpretations can appear out of nowhere. It is not that interpretation creates the sense of importance, but that a sense of importance creates the interpretation. The mind reacts to that importance that the brain generated beforehand. Understanding this process is freeing. You do not have to believe your thoughts, because you know that their source is an exaggerated sense of significance, not a real fact. The way stress works in schizophrenia can be compared to a glass that slowly fills throughout the day. Every drop is a small stressor: lack of sleep, noise, a minor conflict, a difficult conversation, rushing, skipping a meal. None of these drops is dangerous on its own. It will not cause symptoms by itself. But when the glass is nearly full, even a tiny impulse, a soft knock, light that is too bright, someone's comment, can make it overflow. Then tension instantly turns into anxiety, anxiety into interpretation, and interpretation into a symptom. That is why learning to recognize early overfilling is so important. Schizophrenia is not a disease of one single trigger, it is an illness of reduced resistance to the sum of triggers. It is precisely the sum of small things that switches on episodes. Recognizing your own capacity is a key part of therapy. Prodromal signals, seeing the crisis before it arrives. One of the most important parts of relapse prevention is recognizing prodromal signals. These are subtle, often ignored signs that show up hours or days before an increase in symptoms. They can include irritability, sudden sensitivity to sound, trouble focusing your eyes, a sense of a bad day coming, mental chaos, a feeling of unfamiliarity in the body, changes in sleep rhythm, problems with working memory, or the impression that people are behaving strangely, even though nothing has objectively changed. From a therapy point of view, these signals are gold. They warn you that your system is starting to enter overload. If you learn to recognize them, you gain the chance to act before a symptom develops. You can rest, quieten down, return to routine, ask for support, use grounding techniques, or shorten your day. A mind that sees the beginning of the wave is less likely to be swept away by it. Every person living with schizophrenia has their own individual pattern of relapses. This is one of the most important observations in psychiatry. There are no two people who react in exactly the same way to stress, stimuli, and life events. For some, symptoms worsen when there is not enough sleep, for others when there is loneliness, family tension, conflict at work, or chaos at home. For some the problem is too much noise, for others difficult emotions, and for others still a monotony. That is why therapy encourages you to see your schizophrenia not as one general pattern, but as your own story with recurring elements. If you review several past crises, you will notice that each had certain common points: sleepless nights, strong emotions, relationship problems, life changes, periods of tension. These recurring signals form your personal stress map. When you know this map, you develop the ability to anticipate, and anticipating means having control. It is no longer the symptoms that take power over you. You begin to understand when they are coming and how to stop them before they fully unfold. The ABC scheme, stopping the avalanche at the interpretation stage. In CBTP there is a tool called the ABC scheme, which in psychosis-focused work is extremely effective. The letter A stands for activating event, the trigger that appears. It might be a stranger's glance, a co-worker's comment, a sudden noise, or a bodily sensation. The letter B stands for belief or interpretation of that event. He probably knows something about me, they are looking at me, someone is following me, something is wrong. The letter C stands for the consequence, both emotional and behavioral, anxiety, tension, the urge to withdraw, agitation, worsening of the voices. The idea of the ABC scheme is simple. It is not what happened to you that causes the symptom, but how your interpretation colored that event. If you stop the avalanche at stage B, before the interpretation gathers momentum, the symptom will not have time to develop. That is why noticing interpretations is the key to stopping psychosis. You do not try to fight the emotion or the thought. You notice that an interpretation has appeared, and that alone is enough to interrupt the chain of cause and effect. A sensitive brain, not a fault, but a feature. Modern psychiatry emphasizes that schizophrenia is an illness of a sensitive brain. This means that your nervous system reacts to stimuli more strongly than a typical brain. This sensitivity is not a design flaw, it is a neurobiological feature that has to be understood so you can treat yourself gently. A sensitive brain becomes overloaded more quickly, has a harder time returning to balance, and reacts more intensely to changes. Under stress, dopamine rises more sharply, and the perceptual filter becomes less stable. That is why ordinary stimuli seem more important, sounds become louder, and thoughts more quickly take on a dramatic tone. Understanding this mechanism is not meant to increase fear, it is meant to reduce guilt. You are not making things up and you are not overreacting, your brain simply works this way. Since it works like this, mastering the art of recovery, rest, gentleness toward yourself, and wise life planning becomes essential. A sensitive brain can function stably if the environment is friendly to it. Every psychotic symptom, before appearing as a thought, begins in the body. It is the autonomic nervous system, divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches, that is responsible for stress reactions. When you are overloaded, your body starts working in alarm mode, your heart beats faster, muscles tense, your breath becomes shallow, and the brain switches into hyper-alertness. That is why many people with schizophrenia experience sudden feelings of danger without a clear cause. The body has already moved into fight or flight mode, and the mind must somehow explain this, so it creates interpretations. If you learn to notice early signals of autonomic tension, you can stop the process before it reaches your thoughts. A few slow breaths, feeling your feet on the floor, a moment of silence, or leaving a noisy place is often enough. These small, quick techniques restore autonomic balance and stop the cascade that leads to symptoms. Modern research shows that the brain of a person with schizophrenia has a lower dopamine threshold, the level of stress at which dopamine begins to rise too intensely. A healthy brain tolerates high arousal before it starts giving stimuli excessive importance. In schizophrenia, this threshold is much lower. This means that situations which barely affect other people may become too heavy for you. This is not a question of character or maturity, it is a biological property of the nervous system. When dopamine rises, the perceptual filter becomes unstable and the mind starts looking for explanations for the intensity it feels. Then interpretations, associations, and paranoid thoughts appear. Understanding the dopamine threshold helps you care for yourself more wisely. You see that rest, quiet, regularity, breaks during the day, and a stable rhythm are not luxuries, they are ways to prevent dopamine spikes. This is not softness. It is brain hygiene. Summary. Stress and symptom triggers are a natural part of schizophrenia, but they do not appear without cause. Every stimulus, lack of sleep, emotional tension, noise, conflict, fatigue, loneliness, hits a sensitive brain harder than it would hit a healthy one. This sensitivity is what makes ordinary situations take on excessive meaning, and the mind begins to create interpretations that do not arise from facts, but from dopamine overload and activation of the autonomic nervous system. Understanding that symptoms are a response to stress, not a reflection of reality, brings huge relief. It lets you look at your experiences with distance and kindness. When you see that the first signs of relapse are not thoughts but bodily tension, irritability, fatigue, or mental chaos, you gain the ability to act before a symptom fully develops. Getting to know your personal triggers, watching for prodromal signals, understanding the mechanism of giving excessive importance, and learning to stop your reaction at the level of interpretation are tools that protect your mind from the escalation of symptoms. The better you know your own stress map, the easier it is to foresee difficult moments and soften them with simple methods: rest, stepping away from noise, calm breathing, shortening your day, talking to someone you trust. Managing triggers is not about avoiding life, it is about wisely regulating your energy. As you develop this skill, symptoms become less frightening, and each day stops being an unsolved puzzle. You learn to live not next to schizophrenia, but in cooperation with your own brain, which, although sensitive, can function stably when you surround it with the right kind of care.